a schedule. Meaning, I have a list of things that I need to do. And I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, and this, and this, and this. And I need to be at this place at 9, and this place at 10, and this place will be after lunch. Well, many of us are probably like that. We like to be able to do each of these things. And for a lot of us, we've probably uttered something similar to this statement at work. Just tell me what I need to do, and I'll do it. Often, as a school teacher, I've used that term whenever there's all these sort of, well, we could do this, and just tell me what to do, and let me go back and do it. We can all relate to that, right? Well, in church, we sort of have a schedule as well. And I say that because there are 5 things that the New Testament tells for Christians to do on the first day of the week. Just mention a couple of them, or all 4, the first 4 here to start with. First of all, we teach and preach. 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 17, we can read that. Some of us, we might be the teacher. Some of us, we might be the preacher. Some of us, we might just be in the audience, but we are an active participant during this time period. We are listening. We may be commenting or questioning. We hopefully will take that with us and can apply that to something later. Maybe somebody asks us a question. That's something that we do. And we know where that falls on the schedule. We sing. We read about that in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 19. But there's a list of songs that are up there. And we've talked about this a lot this year, where you all have sort of played the role of song selectors, and you've had an active part in it. But we sing these songs, and not every song that we sing is your favorite. Not every song that we sing are you the best at. Some songs are easier or harder to sing. Some of us have different voice levels, but whatever, we have that task that we do. Okay? So after singing, we have active prayer. Acts chapter 12 and verse 5, we can read that, but we say prayers in this congregation communally. Now, they also are said individually. Let's think about that for a second. A few moments ago when Tom was up here praying, Tom was praying, but he was praying on behalf of all of us. And hopefully while you were sitting at your seat, you were hearing, hopefully that applied to you and you thought about what it was. Tossed in a couple of things on your own because you're dealing with something, or maybe you have a neighbor that's been sick or something like that, and the people here don't know it, but we're participating in that. That's a task that we do. We gather around the table. They take the Lord's Supper in Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, and we reflect on, we take time to think about what Jesus did, and Ben was leading us in that here just a few moments ago. But those are all acts of worship that we do each first day of the week. Each of those things are done fairly similar each week. Our role in that is pretty straightforward each time. But the 5th act, and I'm not set them in order, but what we're talking about today is that of taking a collection. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, we read, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there may be no collections when I come." Now I want you to just look at those 2 verses right there, because they say a lot, but in some cases they don't seem to say maybe enough. Okay? So I want to think about this question. Paul wrote to the Corinthians, he said to lay something aside. Store up as he, meaning the giver, store up as he may prosper, that there be no collection when I come. All of that information is quite good, but at no point in those verses does it say an answer to the question, how much should I give? I want you to think about that for a second. How much should I give? We'll go to 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 and 2. That'll tell you, right? Well, okay? But unlike the other 4 acts of worship, which were sort of all communal, we're all acting in the same way, this is the one that's a little bit different. This is the one that maybe falls on us a little bit more. So how much should I give? Well, there's examples of giving in the Old Testament, And there are examples of giving in the New Testament. Let's talk about the Old Testament giving, first of all. And we've hit on a few different ones here. But Abraham tithed to Melchizedek in Genesis chapter 14 and verse 20. So I'm not going to read all of these verses, but these are just to give you some ideas of things that happen. But the word tithe has come to represent what we're doing. Sometimes people say, do you tithe on Sunday? Well, the word tithe is simply means 10%, okay? But it has become a word that means any kind of giving. That 10%, that tithing idea, comes up quite often in the Old Testament. Jacob promised to give a tenth to God on his safe return in Genesis chapter 28. Israel gave free will offerings for the tabernacle. That's in Ezekiel chapters 35 and 30, Exodus 35 and 36. David did the same thing in 1 Chronicles chapter 29. So there's examples of giving to try and benefit the tabernacle, the church, maybe we would call it today, but the organization, whatever you want to. Israel, nation, tithed to God as well. They 1/10 to the Levites, who in turn gave 1/10 to the priest. You can read that in Numbers chapter 18. 1/10 for the festive celebration. You can see that in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 5 through 18. And 1/10 every third year for the poor. That's in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 28 and 29. I feel like I've mentioned this several times here recently, but Ben has said quite often that the 10% that we sometimes think about was a lot more than that. It was 10 and 10 and 10. It was a lot of numbers right there. But as you can see, there's all different kinds of giving. But those are specific numbers. When it says in Deuteronomy chapter 14, when it says 10% to the poor, I need a calculator, right? I can do the math on that. I can figure that up. Here's my check. Here's the 10%. Okay, it may come out into a fraction. Do I round that up? Do I round it down? Is it $15.12 or $13? What would it be? Those were ways Israel gave. They gave not only financially, which we mostly think about with giving, but they also gave from their land. Exodus chapter 23, we read that they left that which grows of itself in the seventh year to the poor. So you raised for 6 years, and that seventh year, that was available for the poor there as well. They allowed people to satisfy their hunger with grapes and grains. That's in Deuteronomy chapter 23. You could go in and get grapes or grains, but you're not allowed to haul it out with you. You can't take a big bushel and just heave it in and take it with you. But if you needed something to eat or something along the way, you can see and do that as well. They left corners for gleanings for the poor around the edges of the fields in Leviticus 19, Deuteronomy chapter 24. Point of this being that there were a lot of different ways that people gave in the Old Testament. As we said a moment ago, it required giving, but quite often that giving necessitated a calculator. Now, I made that first mention a few minutes ago about rounding up or rounding down. If it said $15 and 0.126439, if that's what the fraction was, do you round that up? Is that $15.12 or $15.13? Does it round up to $16? You'd have to make that decision, right? You're the one doing the math. Well, here's the thing. If you turn to Malachi chapter 3, verse 8 through 10, you can see it. It's on the screen here as well. But you know, Malachi is the last book of the Old Testament. And after Malachi, there's about a 4 period of really not much happening. And Malachi, I think, has 4 chapters in it. So this is almost the very end of the Old Testament. Malachi chapter 3, verses 8 and 10. Follow along with me here. Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me. But you say, in what way have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings. You are cursed with the curse, for you have robbed me, even this whole nation. Bring all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and try me now in this, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you such blessing that there will not be room enough to receive it. What he's saying here is, I have extended you everything, but you are, let's go back to the calculator, you're rounding down. You're not participating. You're not doing what you're supposed to do. I have asked you to do this. I've asked you to give hand. I've asked you to give from. I've asked you to help the poor, help the needy, whatever it might be. And he says in the first part of verse 8, will a man rob God? So I want us to think about that as we go into the New Testament. Just keep that sentence, will a man rob God? Keep that in your head, because I want to talk now about New Testament giving. New Testament giving, we see this in several cases as well. While preaching and teaching, Jesus challenged his disciples to give. If you turn to Luke chapter 6 and verse 38 and read on here with me. Jesus said, give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be put in your bosom. For with the same measure that you, it will be measured back to you. What Jesus is saying right here is that if you give, you're going to be given right back to. You help, we're going to help you. You help, I help, we all help, this kind of thing right here. And this is so what he's saying here. So we shouldn't be like holding on, because giving is going to result in a positive for us as well. But it wasn't just Jesus. Paul talked about this as well. In his letters to various churches, he emphasized giving. We can look at a few different ones right here. To the Corinthians, he said to lay by in store. Anybody know how often? He said weekly, right? So do it every week. Every week. There's 52 weeks in a year, right? They roll through. And it says to lay by in store weekly. That's what he told to the people at Corinth. To the people at Ephesus, he said to might give to those in need. Ben talked about that, or prayed about that. This ability that we have to have a job. Some of us still have jobs. Some of us have worked a lot and are able to retire now. But this ability that we have to be able to give comes from our ability to work. He said we should be out working, and whenever we get this paycheck, then we should use that to give to others who need help from it. To the Hebrews, it said to do good and to share. Think about that. To do good and to share. What's the first thing we teach kids when they're little? Teach them how to share, right? And they struggle with it, right? Everybody who's ever had multiple kids probably knows that sharing is the difficult thing. If you have an only child, I guess they don't have to, right? But if you have a twin sister who's there literally every minute of your life, you got to figure out how to share sometimes whenever you are growing up. But it says to do good and to share. Why do we not like to share? Well, we kind of like to be ourselves. We like it to be for us. And you can maybe have it when I'm done, but I kind of want it right now. Well, sometimes we think about our giving the same way. I don't really want to share. I want it for myself. And when I'm done with it, whatever's left, you can take that. That's what he says not to do to the Hebrews. Instead, to do good and to share. But it's not just Paul dictating how they should give. There's a lot of other examples of giving in the New Testament. I think they're all listed up here. I want to hit on each one of these here. And I want you to think about how giving was done from these people. Let's start first with Luke chapter 19 and verse 8. Go to Luke chapter 19 and verse 8 if you've got it there handy. A story that you'll familiar. I'm just going to read a verse, a singular verse here from it. But we read here, then Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, look, Lord, I gave half of my goods to the poor, and I have taken anything, if I have taken anything from anyone by false accusation, I restore, he said, fourfold. What he's saying right there is he says, Zacchaeus, who was criticized, who was somebody who was a tax collector. The story we talk about him being short and he climbed up in a tree. But I was reading something this week and it makes me wonder. They said the thing that said maybe he had to climb up in the tree because nobody would let him in front because nobody liked him. That might be the case right there. I don't know. But it said, he said, if I've done wrong, I'm going to give up half. I'm going to restore it fourfold to it. Do we think about it like that? Do we give with that sort of same open heart that he had? Luke chapter 21, verses 1 through 4. I think you'll recognize this story. And he looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury. And he saw a certain poor widow putting in 2 mites. So he said, truly I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all. For all these out of their abundance have put in offerings for God, but she out of her poverty put in all the livelihood that she has. Now think about that story. All of us know that story of this poor widow, right? But I can almost imagine it if there's a table or something like this, that the rich man's coming in with like bags over. Just think about like the bag that Santa Claus is carrying, right? You're hauling that in right there and just dumping it out. And here's the second bag and the third bag. Well, if somebody comes walking in like that from that back row all the way to here, who's going to notice it? Everybody. And they're going to say, woo, look at what that man's giving, right? But it said there in Luke, it said out of his abundance he gave. But then it said there was this poor woman and that she gave 2 mites. I don't know what a mite is, but it ain't much. But she laid, whatever word you want to do, her 2 mites into there. It said not out of abundance for the other, but out of her poverty, right? She didn't have 2 mites to give, but she trusted that giving this, there would be a return to her. We just saw that, right? If we give, it'll come back to us. She trusted that that would be the case. Not for anybody to see, because nobody's going to look at her putting her 2 pennies in and say, woo, look at that. That's the most impressive thing in the world. But who noticed it? Jesus said it, right? He said that's what he noticed. There's a difference there in New Testament giving. Acts chapter 4, verses 34 and 35. This is, nor was there anyone among them who lacked. For all who were possessors of lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of the things that were sold and laid them at the apostles' feet, and they distributed to each as anyone had need. The early church firmly believed, I cannot be convinced otherwise, that Jesus' return was going to happen by the end of the week. I don't think there was any doubt that they expected it. But they took everything that they had and put it together and said, we're going to put it all in this pile and we'll help whoever needs help. Now think about that. Do we do that? What would we do if we even considered that today? We would say that sounds like a cult type behavior. That sounds like craziness. But that's what they did. They put everything together. That leads to a problem a little later on with Ananias and Sapphira. And we'll get to that here in just a second. But if we go further, the next 2 verses, Acts 4, 36 and 37, and Barnabas, a Levite of the country of Cyprus, having land, sold it, brought the money, and laid it at the apostles' feet. Barnabas had this land, and he said, I've sold it. Here's the money. Do with it what we need. Help those who need help. I suspect there were people in the audience who said, wow, that was a really nice thing. Because it's just a couple of verses later that we read Ananias and Sapphira. They said, we've sold a piece of land as well. And they said, here is the money. I'm making the numbers up, but they said, here. The reality was it was 2, right? And they just so wow, we're going to look as good as Barnabas did. We still got a little money in the hip pocket right there. When they called them in and realized that, the story says they both dropped dead. The point of that being is they were not giving the way that they should have. They were giving to be seen. I don't see anything from what Barnabas did right there that he was meant to be seen, because those 2 verses come right after the previous 2 where everybody said they pulled the money together to try and help. I don't know that it's feasible for us to take every dime that we have and pull it together. It doesn't really work financially that way, but our thoughts should be the same thing. If there are people in this building that need help, we should be willing to help. Not just us individually, but the church, because the church is not the building, but the entity. And my money, whatever it is in there, and your money, whatever in there, is all the church should all be used to help as well. Finally, Romans chapter 15. Romans chapter 15. Because there were poor saints in Jerusalem, we read 25 and 26. But now I'm going to Jerusalem to minister to the saints, Paul said. For it pleased those from Macedonia and Achaia to make certain contribution for the poor among the saints who are in Jerusalem. Paul said that there were people in congregations that he had been to that said, there are poor people in Jerusalem that need this. Take this and help them have it. We should be out for that same need as well. Difference in Old Testament and New Testament giving is quite apparent from these verses. There is no explicit dollar amount mentioned in the New Testament. You'll notice in the Old Testament, each example that we gave, 10%, this or that. Leave a little every 3 years, every 7 years. In the New Testament, give what you can. Give what's in your heart. There's a difference there between the 2. So I want us to think about, to finish up, a few guiding principles maybe for giving. Because I asked you at the start, how much should I give? And I have yet to answer that question, right? Let's look at a few things to start with. First of all, as we prosper, it should be keeping with our level of prosperity. We read about just a few moments ago the poor widow, right? Well, she was described as a poor widow, and the other person in the story is described as being rich. How many of us know people that are rich, that are poor, and that fall anywhere on the line in between? Most, if not all of us do, okay? Because since the beginning of time, that's sort of the way it's fallen. It's always been that way. Jesus said you'd always have the poor with you. They always will be poor folks. There will always be rich people. There will always be people that fall right there in the middle. And so asking to give as we prosper, if you were to say a hard number, you must give $100 every week. That's not feasible in all cases, right? If you were to say you have to give $100, that man stuff could have done it, but could the poor widow? She couldn't have done that at all. Well, was her heart in the right place when she gave her 2 mites? Of course it was. But she just wasn't prospering the way that others were. We should give principle 1 as we prosper. But I don't know how you prosper, and you don't know how I prosper. Number 2, guiding principle number 2, seek to abound. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 20, this is early in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talked about how much the Pharisees gave. And Jesus would spend a lot of time criticizing the Pharisees. And even in this, he was criticizing. But he talked about how much they gave. He later said in Matthew 23:23 that the Pharisees tithed, but they neglected other parts of the law. That sometimes happens in the church. Well, I'm going to do anything I want. I'll toss $100 in on Sunday and that'll pay it forward, right? Don't got to worry about anything else, because that church couldn't keep the lights on. They couldn't pay the preacher. They couldn't help anybody without my wallet. So they're not going to say anything to me. Well, Jesus said that was wrong of the Pharisees, but he also said that we should seek to abound, that we should give more than that. They're giving a lot and living a bad life. We should give as we prosper. We should give as well while living a good life. Guiding principle number 3. Do so willingly and bountifully. Turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 9 here. We're almost finished, but I want to look at 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 5 through 7. I don't think these are going to be new verses for most of us. But we read here, starting 2 Corinthians 9, starting in verse 5. Therefore, I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren to go to you ahead of time and prepare your generous gift beforehand, which you had previously promised, that it may be ready as a matter of generosity and not as a grudging obligation. Think about that for a second. Our gift should be a matter of generosity, not as a grudging obligation. A lot of us pay a lot of grudging obligation during the course of the week, right? I really hate to pay the electric bill, but I like the lights to be on. I really hate to pay the cable bill, but I like watching the UK games, right? I hate to pay the medical bill, but I sure like being healthy. But we pay all of these things, and it's like $63.12. I'm $63.13, right? I'm going to pay it exactly what it is. And if I can wait till 2 or 3 notices before I pay it, that'll even be better, right? I don't want them to give it. But this, we read about here, what Paul said was that you were not a grudging obligation, but rather as a matter of generosity. Verse 6, but this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. So let each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, but it says there what? For God loves a cheerful giver. Very few of us are cheerful givers for the cable bill or the electric bill, but we should be a cheerful giver for the work of the church. Number 4, we should give purposefully. Just as we read there a second ago, we should have it purposed in our hearts. It needs to be planning and attention to it. It shouldn't be line item number 12, but rather line item number 1. We get these things every month. We get an email that says what the school board of education is going to be talking about. And sometimes it's long and sometimes it's short. And this, and this. But we also have notifications that say if you want to be on the agenda, you got to get your information in there in time. Otherwise, it's not going to go there. Well, our giving should be in time, and it should be at the top of the list. When the paycheck comes, whatever it might be, our first thought should be church, then cable, then house, then whatever it might would be. And you might say, well, I can't make the math add up. Well, something may have to be cut. We budget all the time. We cut all the time. What'll it be? That's up to you. That's your decision. We got to make that work. It should be done purposely. Finally, the last one should be done cheerfully. We read just a moment ago that God loves a cheerful giver. If we can't give cheerfully, there's no reason to give at all. It shouldn't be they shouldn't have to steal it from us, basically. We shouldn't be sitting there gripping the dollar as tight as we can and have to rip it out of our hands. But there are some people that kind of fall into to. They don't want to necessarily give that way. If you're paying attention, we're 25 minutes and we're about done. I've still not answered the question. I said at the beginning, how much should I give? The easy answer, and what most of us would have loved to have heard, $10, $20, $100, 50 cents, whatever it might be. Because with so many things in our life, we kind of fall into that, just tell me what to do and I'll do it. But here's the thing. When they don't tell you what to do, you got to figure it out. And sometimes when we figure it out, we put a little more thought. When you just tell me what to do, I'll just churn it out and I'm not thinking. I think when we see in the New Testament, giving was not a tell me what to do and I'll do it, but think about it and consider it for a while. We examine it's in giving or whatever it might would be, but the answer is in our hearts. The answer to the question is between us and God, right? But when we give, the Bible says that we are laying up our treasure in heaven. It says that when we give, that where our treasure is, there will our heart be also. If our treasure is in our hip pocket, that's where our heart is as well. But the hip pocket doesn't go to heaven. Our soul is what goes. And so when we give, think about that. I can't answer the question. But whether you're the rich man or the woman with the mites or whoever, anywhere in between, whichever the case it may be, as long as you've got it figured out between you and God, there's no hard number. It's all right there. If there's anything that we can do to help you, any way to help you, we invite you to come while we stand and sing.